All right, I think I've got my self set up. Okay, so welcome back to another summer of drawing. I'm in a slightly different location in my studio today, and there's a fire alarm going off in the background. So I hope you don't hear any of that, and we'll just be able to proceed. But today, what we're going to be talking about is memory and imagination. And if you were in the classes last summer for Summer of Drawing, we did a couple of classes on that about, basically how to, for those classes, it was more about how to, edit, move things around, rely on your memory and imagination to add things into a drawing or a painting. And we're sort of going to enlarge upon that this week. So let me get started here. All right, here we go. Okay, so another summer of drawing, class number 18 on the theme of home. And this is going to be very puzzling until we get into the class, but gnome and boat are the two themes today, and they tie into home very peripherally. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But first, I want to talk. We're just going to go through a little bit of discussion. I want to do a recap of memory and imagination from last summer, and then talk about why I'm going to put you through the exercises we're going to do today. So memory is the faculty by which the mind stores and remembers information. And imagination is the faculty of action of forming new ideas or images or concepts of external objects not present to the senses. It's also the ability of the mind to be creative or resourceful. And that's really what I'm talking about. When we start drawing, we don't really have a very good data bank of images because we just haven't been looking at things that hard. Once we start drawing, particularly if we draw certain subjects over and over again, we get to the point where even if we didn't have that thing in front of us, say it was a tree or something like that, we could do a pretty good representation. And the bits that we couldn't do, we could fill in by either going and looking at a tree, finding a picture of a tree, et cetera, et cetera. And we find, though, that once we really get into drawing and we want to use larger concepts and make more interesting drawings, that some of those things that we want to draw are really outside of the bounds of anything that we have ever even tried to sketch before. And there's a tendency to not put things in drawings that we haven't tried. Of course, this is why I want you to draw all kinds of things. But so last year when we were talking about it, we were just saying, the goal in art is to communicate, even if it's just to ourselves. So memory and imagination are a vital part of that. We're not constrained just by what we see in front of us. So we said last summer that the step number one is observing the world around you, practicing your drawing technique. So you guys are already doing a ton of this. Developing your own visual point of view. And that is just really, what do you like to draw? What captivates you most? So rather than drawing the things that you think you should, like, oh, I should draw this bridge, or I should draw the portico of this building. You're drawing the things that you actually like. Maybe there's a little weed growing by the portico of that building and you'd really rather draw that. And then step 3, using your memory and imagination to edit, rearrange, replace, and create the most excellent version of your ideas. So for example, say you were drawing the weed at the front of the portico, there might be other stuff lying there, like trash or whatever it happened to be. You don't want that in your drawing. You're going to take that out. Even if you take a photo to do the drawing of later, you'll edit that out. And that's just a matter of confidence. And so now we're going to take that to the next step, which is well, first of all, we've been talking all summer long, and you guys know this really well now, that as you advance as an artist, rather than just reproducing things that you see, your goal becomes more concrete. It's essentially threefold. You're trying to have strong design, convincing form to the subject matter, strong design overall to your drawing, and telling some kind of story. So even if that story is just, hey, look at the interesting shadow that's formed by this vase on the table. That could be, that could be as simple as the story is. Now, talking about storytelling and drawing, the Martha's Vineyard Drawing Prize just wrapped up for 2022. And if you go to the website, mvdrawingprize.com, you will see some amazing takes on a particular theme, on the theme of home. And these people definitely decided to figure out some way to tell a story. And I think it's really helpful to see how other artists went about doing that and realizing that, you can create your own world with your pencils. So step 4, which we've done all summer long, is using your technical visual abilities, which is, observing, analyzing what needs to be in the scene, Is it a good sense of design, using your note ends, measuring angles, checking proportions, trying to get things right from the start, using correct perspective, looking at the light source and the shadows in the dark. So that's all sort of the technical visual stuff. And you'll work on that for the rest of your life. We all do. I mean, that's just stuff. It's fun to work all of those things out. And then your technical drawing abilities, that's what we've really been concentrating on, varying the hardness of the pencils, varying the paper type, white or toned paper, varying the stroke direction, the pressure and the stroke length that you might be using when you're drawing, varying the lead shape, varying the way you hold the pencil. So all of that stuff is, I'm going to encourage you to keep doing all of those things in step 5. What's going to happen is you'll find those things that you really like and you want to keep using them over and over again. But every now and again, try to pull in some of the other stuff, give it a shot. Um, it's all about having as many tools that you feel comfortable with to be able to draw any subject matter that comes along. So now we're going to add in the final step, which is basically creating new made up scenes using memory and imagination. So, you know, if everybody's getting tense right now, don't worry about it. It's not as if you've got to remember every detail of everything you'd ever want to draw, and it's supposed to be in your head waiting to come out. Because, when you just look at things, sure, you've got an impression, say, of a fan or a vase or whatever it happens to be around. But unless you've drawn it and drawn it from a number of different angles, it's not really in there able to come out into a drawing in a fully realized form. But what is there is the concept, the idea of a fan. And the general, if you've drawn a fan or if you've drawn something else, you've got a general idea of what it looks. And so what I'm suggesting to start with is, as you're creating new and made up scenes, which is sort of, where we want to get to, we want to bring in realistic items. It doesn't mean it doesn't have to be realistic, but this is your world. You're controlling it. The piece of paper is for you to put on whatever it is you want. You can pull in this item and that item and place them together. Based on your knowledge of observation, you'll be able to make it look the way you'd like to. But that is helped by doing a lot of drawing of various different subject matter. And what I do, and this is what we're going to do today, is starting out with an idea that you sketch quickly, that maybe based on something. I'm going to show you some images that you're going to sketch, and then we're going to put them together in odd combinations. The idea being not that you remember everything that you saw when you were drawing, but the more times you draw a subject, the better you'll get at sort of, the overall shape, the shading, some of the details. And so what I tend to do when I'm trying to think of a concept for a painting or drawing is I'll do these little thumbnails of stuff, even without reference material around. I don't necessarily have the object in front of me. But I say I have an idea that I want a dog running through the fields and there's a big storm cloud coming in. Well, I can sketch something that looks basically like that and then go off and find the reference, take pictures of dogs running, go look at the field, find some imagery or whatever. I think that there's a tendency to get wrapped up in photo reference, or conversely get wrapped up in that everything has to be drawn from life, that you can't, that it's one or the other, either that or you have to sort of mix them together in some way, and that memory and imagination doesn't play a part. But I think it plays the most important part, and that life reference and photo reference are just there to sort of bolster your idea, to kind of to bring it to life. So what we're going to be doing today is thumbnailing, sketching, thinking about composition, remembering sort of the general shapes and forms of things we see as we go from one exercise to the other, with very little reference to life imagery. So what you end up with may not look very good. Don't worry about it. You'll understand as we do this how valuable it is just to keep drawing stuff, because the more stuff you draw, the easier it is to do this kind of concepting. And then once you have your rough, and sometimes, let me tell you, my roughs are so rough as to be indistinguishable to anyone else. But I kind of know what I need to find. Oh, I need to find a picture of this tree bending like that, or this flower bending like that, whatever it happens to be, a person walking down the street in a certain way. And then I can go out and either look for them in real life or find some photos. So you do not need to be chained to either photos or real life. You're in control. This is your world you're creating, and you can draw it as you wish. That means stylistically, the objects that are in it, and how you draw them. So if that makes you nervous, there's an easy solution, which is observing and practice. All right, so, like I said, we're just doing all this review to begin with, so before we get into the drawing. And I just wanted to remind you how well you've done already. We're on the 18th of 19 classes, and look at what we have drawn so far. I am sure as you look at this list of all of these things, not all of you have been able to watch all of these classes, but I'm sure you've been here for some of them. And you can see in your mind the picture that you drew, the sketch that you made, or the drawing you made for the various different subject matter. It's actually extraordinary, the number of different subject matter that we drew this summer. And if I had asked you right now, say you were in the class where we drew the Portal Dolmen in Ireland with the big stones. If I told you right this moment with no reference to draw that, you would be able to come up with a decent approximation, perhaps not exactly accurate, but of a dolmen, what a dolmen looks like, what the scenery behind looked like, because the act of drawing really lodged it in your brain. So, years ago when I started off in art, the Macintosh computer had just kind of come into art departments, but a lot of us were still saving um, file folders full of clippings, pictures you'd see in National Geographic of dolphins or whatever it happened to be. And we hadn't really figured out how to sort of segue to doing file folders on the computer and lodging images. The internet wasn't really out there with its wealth of information that it is at the moment. And so we relied on pulling out those file folders and sort of laying out our reference when we wanted to draw a dolphin, because we didn't really have anything else that we could look at. And I think that, now we have this bevy of imagery available. We have a tendency to think of, oh, I just have to snap a whole bunch of pictures and I'll be able to look at that later. But I'm sure you, just like I, when you come back from your vacation, unless you sit down and look at those pictures again, you don't remember those objects. But if you sketch them, you do. If you sketch them, the imagery comes right back to you, regardless of how good your sketch was, which is really wonderful. So I thought I'd show you a couple of Norman Rockwell images just because they're fun. This is where he would have decided on an idea in his head and done a rough sketch, figured out kind of how it ought to look, hired a model, put her or him in a particular position, enough for him to have, the photo reference he needed to work from. And then when he completed his painting, he used a combination of the photo. He might have done other setups of other arrangements of the toys. Some of it might have just been out of his head because he now knew how to draw all sorts of things. But it's really kind of fun to see how he would use family and friends and kind of put them in a position to sort of fill in the gaps. Once he had his concept, he didn't start with the model like this. He started with his concept, which could be whatever he wanted. And then he decided to fill things in, or take things in, take them out as they went. I did think it's funny, the one that he's got art books under that woman, and one of them is a book on Leonardo paintings. So all of us collect those art books over time. And here's another one of those. Where he not only does he have this friend of his, acting as the security guard in the museum for this wonderful painting, but notice how he's also got his feet. He put books under the guy's feet so that he could get that forced feeling of movement. That's the sort of idea that comes from your initial sketch. You don't necessarily think of that when a model is in front of you, but you would have, if you were Norman Rockwell and you were trying to draw with that kind of exaggerated action that he was known for, you would want to then make sure that you understood what was that going to do to the front of the guy's pants leg. How would the shoes look? And then he adapted that to his painting. So that's the part about filling in the gaps later. What we're going to do first is just that initial, just dive in and try an idea. So gnomes, garden gnomes. I figure garden gnomes are close to home. So I actually think garden gnomes are kind of an interesting subject matter, because they started off being a lot less like the dwarves that we sort of think of them as now. There was a book about gnomes that came out, I think, in the early 90s, and they were very dwarf-like looking. And so garden gnomes these days have a tendency to look like that, whereas early garden gnomes just looked more like kind of ugly fairy creatures out there in the garden. So what I'd like you to do first, and we're not going to spend a ton of time at each stage, but a good 5 minutes, is for you just to draw a gnome. And your gnome doesn't have to look like this, or it can look exactly like one of these, or a combination thereof. Basically, you've got a little guy with a beard and a hat. And some garden gnomes hold shovels or pipes or have wheelbarrows or watering cans. You don't have to put that in, but that's just sort of a gnome-like thing to have. They often are wearing tunics or aprons. And so we're going to do an exercise where you're first going to draw this garden gnome, and then we're going to look at a little scene and put the garden gnome in that scene. So as you draw your gnome, don't worry a ton about how realistic it looks. What you're after are the general the general shape and form and bits that make up a garden gnome. So this is the kind of thing that you might do. Say you went to somewhere and you saw an interesting sculpture or the facade of a building, or I don't know what it could possibly be, but some small thing where you didn't really have time to draw the details, but that particular object was unique enough that you wanted to record in general, what that sort of thing might be. Oh, I've got an idea, like a gargoyle on the side of a building. Unless you needed to do a portrait of a particular gargoyle, the general gargoyle-ness, it was really all you were after. And so it's the same today. We're just sort of going, hey, garden gnomes, we kind of know what they are. Probably you, like me, we've never actually looked at a garden gnome before. I will also say that I had put on the class that you could work in toned paper today, but if you just want to work on white paper and not toned, that's fine. The only reason I suggested toned paper was because it's a little faster. You just have to kind of do the darks and the lights. You don't have to fill things in. But I haven't done any drawings myself this week. This is all on you. You'll have my drawings again next week. And and so, however you want to draw them with whatever materials you can. I should also say that I have not sent around the PDF or uploaded the video from last week. When I was down in DC, things got a little busy. And so I've got those items ready to upload later today. So I'll send you both PDFs and upload both videos at the same time. And that way people watching later can catch up as well. So I was fascinated actually to find out a little of the history of garden gnomes while I was busy looking for this reference for you. And like I said, there are these little kind of concrete or often cast iron sort of sprites that people would put around their garden. They were often just painted in black and red. They would just have the little red head and perhaps a little bit of color on their faces. And some people really didn't like them. They really thought that you were not necessarily evil spirits or whatever, but they just didn't care for them. And then garden gnomes sort of went out of fashion for many, many decades. And I think, around the time that this fellow put out his gnomes book with all of these different pictures of gnomes, they sort of saw a resurgence. And now if you actually search for garden gnomes online, you find many, many, many different sorts, some of them rather rude, actually. We're not using those as our models. But I liked these ones, the more classic sort of garden gnome. And some of the antique ones are really kind of fascinating because they border more on the gargoyle end of things, a little bit more on the grotesque. The idea that these, little sprites are out in your garden helping out, I think was the original idea behind them. So now that you've got your gnome, somewhat under control, let's see, I'll just give you a couple more minutes on that. So if you haven't got a ton of detail in there, don't worry. You're going to be drawing your gnome again. It's more a matter of going, okay, we got a little guy. He shoes could be pointed or not pointed. He could be wearing a leather jerkin or a tunic. He could be wearing an apron. It tends to have beards, tends to have a prominent nose, maybe smiling, pointy hat. So if you've got all of that noted, then we're good to go, and we'll move on to the next step. So when you're trying to draw something in winter, I've talked about this quite a bit, about how, particularly if you're working on white paper, you don't have to draw anything where the white is. And if you're working on toned paper, all you have to worry about are the very dark areas and the snow, because the midtones, kind of, if you squint and look at the picture on the right, with the little Cupid fellow on the gravestone, all of those midtones that aren't either very dark or white, are just the paper color. So depending on which paper color you're using, it does make a difference as to how you go about your drawing, but the idea is basically the same. You don't end up having to put in a lot of extra outlines around everything, because your paper color does some of the work for you. So if we look at statuary and how snow falls on items out there in the ground in general, it has a lot to do, of course, with how the snow is falling. And this is the kind of thing that falls into the observe category, because this winter, as it snows and you look out there and you want to draw things, you'll become overwhelmed to begin with by all the variety that you see, the tracery and the trees and all the rest of it. And it's kind of better to focus in on little things. You may not have, this type of thing out in your backyard, but you can see what I'm talking about. So as snow falls, if it snows directly from above, it's only going to land on the objects in ways that it can hit the object. So that's very much like light. Where the snow can't get to, it usually doesn't fall there. If it's blowing around, of course, you'll end up with statues that are coated with things. But in both of these cases, it looks like there was sort of a gentle snowfall that came down on top and just covered these objects with things. So what you're going to do as your first exercise is sketch a gnome. Sketch a gnome in snow. And so I've just given you these different pictures as kind of hints, because I don't necessarily want you to stress about drawing any of those three gnomes we looked at in precisely this scene. Not at all. But I do want you to think about, just out of your head, without worrying about, do I have the exact reference? In general, if you sketch your gnome and add a little snow to him and snow kind of around him, and some bushes, how would that look? So if you're working on toned paper, the way that would look is that you would be adding in your snow as white, right? So you would just only worry about doing a little outline of your gnome and maybe some really very light lines to indicate where some of these trees are. But look at how much dark there is, right? There's a lot of dark, from the bushes themselves. And then you've got the snow coming down. The paper color can be things like, the branches or whatever you'd like it to be. You can make the dark of the foliage you see here, you can make all that the paper color and just have, add a little bit of dark in there and have the snow kind of piling on top of your gnome and some of the, whether it's grasses or bushes or whatever you have around. If you're working on white paper, you can, in this particular case, you can leave a lot of things white. What you have to do is try not to draw in where the white snow is supposed to be. And that can be kind of difficult. It's a good idea to start off with just a little bit of sort of kind of like we did last week, where we sort of reserved the edges of things, where we knew the white was going to be, to make sure you don't draw in there. And instead, what you'll be doing on the white paper is concentrating on, kind of what the gnome looks like, leaving areas blank where the snow has fallen on the gnome. And of course, think about, no matter whether it's toned paper or white paper, the gnome's feet are probably in the snow. So whereas we drew the gnome's feet before, we won't have to draw them now, but we will have to sort of show that snow is banked up some way. Now, one of the reasons I'm not showing you specifically how I would go about doing that is because I kind of need you in this sort of nervous position about not knowing what it looks like and having to go, okay, I can kind of make a guess, what snow banked up against a gnome's feet looks like and how much snow might actually land on the point of a gnome's hat. If the gnome's hat's over a little bit, it'll get more snow. If it's pointy and the snow came down, how much would that be? So these little thumbnails that you do, these little concept ideas, are exactly the place where you kind of identify, okay, I probably need some more information here, but I'm just going to sketch what I think it looks like. Because somebody like Norman Rockwell, when he came to his final, even though he had some photo reference, he was sketching stuff as much as he imagined it might look like. All right, so when you get the PDF later and you look at the painting he did of the woman exhausted in the toy shop, you'll see that she has a kind of a cashier receipt book on her lap, and some of the papers are spilling out of that. Now, he might have just made that up out of his imagination, just sort of knowing what layers of colored paper might look like. But the other thing that's really important is that as long as we understand what's going on, that she's so tired she can't even hold onto this book, and the register sheets are coming out, or the receipts are coming out, as long as we understand that, it doesn't matter whether or not that's exactly how they look in real life. And so the same with your gnome. This is a pretty confusing type of scene to look at, this winter scene. And it's what we typically see. We go, oh, I should draw this. And then we see this, right? And it's really overwhelming. So it's really useful, I think, to do a sketch that includes much less of what's going on. And that happens because when we actually just concept out of our heads, we don't include all this detail. We might put 3 or 4 pieces of grass to represent a huge clump. Our bush might only have a few branches on it out of simplicity. And when it comes time to actually do the final drawing, that simplicity is very good to keep in mind, rather than then just taking all of the photo reference we have and adding in exactly the same complexity we see. What happened when we kind of edited naturally, because we just didn't know what something looked like exactly? When we edited naturally out of our heads, we usually end up with a more simplified scene that is really symbolic of what is actually going on. A bush with 3 or 4 branches on it with snow is just as communicative as one with 50 branches on. And unless you're really trying to show how very complicated a bush can look with snow on it, there's really no reason to put a lot of extra stuff just because it's in the photograph. So, so starting off like this with a sketch that you make where you're not really sure, of all the detail. Maybe you don't have any pictures around. Maybe you actually don't really like this particular bush, but like the idea. Maybe you like the idea of a tree around the gnome, or the gnome is standing over by the table or something like that, but you want it to be a different table. It doesn't matter. You just kind of sketch a little layout. And then what you do is you kind of look at that and go, okay, if I'm thinking about what Elizabeth kind of made me go through with notan and thumbnails and all of that before we get to, an actual drawing, do I have good balance in this composition here, just at the sketch form? Even before you get any further, just while it's still an idea in your head, do I need to add a few darks behind that gnome so that the snow that's landed on him looks snow-like? And that's kind of why I showed you this little statue over here, because the dark behind actually kind of helps, bring out the idea that you've got the snow coming down. And this is, like I said, this is super complicated. This is not something that you're really going to be able to pull off an amazing version of, just in a few minutes. And so because I've now stressed you out with the snow, we're going to move on to the next stage in this. And you're probably like, thank goodness. Okay, here we go. Back to the gnome. We're back at the gnome again. I want you to draw the gnome again. Now that you've had the opportunity to realize that you've got to pull it out of memory in your sketch, I'd like you to draw another gnome. Now you can either keep drawing the one you were drawing before and just add some more detail and stuff to it, or you can draw another gnome if you didn't like your first one. And I'm just going to take a slug of coffee while you're getting started on that. And this is really all part of my insidious way of, a year from now, if someone said, hey, will you draw a gnome for me? You will be able to draw a gnome. When you draw an object more than once, and especially when after you've drawn it once and you try to draw it out of your memory, you haven't got it quite right, and you have to go back and try to draw it again. Once you do that, you have lodged that imagery in your mind in a way that nothing else can. No photo on your phone, no folder of images, no hard copies. We used to rip them out of magazines, nothing like that. Nothing substitutes for actually drawing objects and for drawing as many odd objects as possible. So even though I'm always talking about, you know, a drawing that tells a story and, you know, why are you drawing this? And, you know, what's your point of view? It's perfectly okay to fill sketchbooks with just pictures of stuff. It could be anything, could be the web camera, could be a fan, could be, I've got this little, I don't even know what you call it, that you put on top of the pellet stove and put water in it so that, I guess, like a dehumidifier or a humidifier. um, you know, I could draw that because the more objects you draw, you have to keep thinking about proportion and angles and shading and light and this, that, and the other. And the more you do that, the more you can then draw objects that are similar that you may not know about. Here's an example. For example, if you've drawn a can, a cylindrical object of anything, then some other cylindrical object like a silo on the side of a building will be easier to draw because you understand a little bit about how to draw a cylindrical object. You know, as simple as that. If you've drawn one type of boat, you might not really know the details. Oops, sorry, there goes the fire alarm. You might not necessarily know the details of what you're actually going to be, you know, drawing on this next boat, but you've got some idea of what a boat-like shape would be, and it gives you a starting point. So finish up your second gnome here. I know this is fast, but you know, I'm just trying to. This is more an exercise in understanding how to go about using memory and imagination more than making sure you've got a beautiful gnome drawing. You can always go back and do that later. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the next thing. The snow globe. Now we're going to put the garden gnome in the snow globe. So you already know a couple of things. One is, and if you're working on toned paper today, this is actually going to be easier because you'll see how all of that gray is really your toned paper. If you're working on white paper today, don't try to fill everything in. Don't worry about the background. You know, you can put a little bit of grayness to the snow globe itself just to make it, you know, look glass-like. But don't worry too much about that. What we're really trying to do more is put the gnome that we can remember from our imagination or from our sketch into the snow globe and have it somewhat obscured by the snow. In this case, snow is you know, going around. How do we show that in a drawing? So if you're working on toned paper, you've got it kind of easy because you can use your white charcoal pencil to make the snow. If you're working on white paper, it's a little more difficult. You might want to do something like blending a light gray color where there isn't the snow, sort of having that come around down to the feet of the near the feet of the gnome. I'm like, oh, what am I drawing here? And then use your eraser to erase out some of that of the gray that you've smudged around. So, you know, this is another situation where the materials you use really do kind of change your approach. And each one of them has its pluses and minuses depending on what it is you're actually drawing. But the idea here is that if I were to, you know, and even if I hadn't shown you this reference, if I had told you, you know, a half an hour ago, 45 minutes ago, you know, draw a gnome in a snow globe, that might have been difficult if you had never drawn a gnome or a snow globe before. So obviously having an opportunity to draw an object once is very helpful. Having an opportunity to draw it twice is even more. But even if you didn't have any idea, you could probably have made up a little dude with a pointy hat. And you've seen it probably a snow globe, so you would know it was a round thing and you would put it in there. And you'd at least have the starting point. Oops, sorry, there's the fire alarm again. Now they're all going off. Okay. So the idea is that whether or not we've ever drawn an object before, whether we've even seen the stuff that goes into the particular drawing, we can at least make a stab in the right direction in order to put a composition together. And that courage to do that, regardless of whether or not we really know what something looks like, is so important. Because that's that concept going, hey, you know, wouldn't it be kind of cute if I drew a card this year that had a, you know, garden gnome in a snow globe, and that could be my Christmas card. I never drawn either one of those things, but I think it would look something like this. Then I go off and start looking for garden gnomes and reference and all the rest of it to put it all together. if you've already drawn some of these objects, it just makes it that much easier to understand how your composition might look. It just gets you further down the field. But what I think is very difficult when people are told you must only draw from life, or you know, you're getting so used to photo reference that you're not drawing in any other manner. It's really important to use your own memory and imagination as a way to snap you out of that, and to remind you that both of those things, real life and photos, are just they're just the filling in the pie. They help you out. They fill in the gaps, but it's your idea that's the most important thing. The rest of it is just the details that you're going to put in. So we're going to move on to the next exercise. Don't worry about how this looks. This is just, we're just going through the whole shebang. And now boats. The title of the class was Gnome and Boat, and now we have the boat part. So what I'd like you to do, I've got a picture here of the Alabama, which is one of the schooners down here in Vineyard Haven Harbor. But I'd like you to draw any one of these boats you see here, or even a different boat, as a boat model. So just like this, you see the boat models, you look at them from the side, the sails are all set very flat, and there's a stand of some sort. So just do a quick sketch, and I just included the Alabama because it was local, not because you have to do something that complicated. If you would really prefer to do one of these other boats, because they're far more simple, completely understand. So the idea right now with drawing this is that as you're drawing, you're observing certain things about boats and about boat models. First, of course, a boat model is usually shown, if it's a sailing boat, it is often shown, I should say, with the sails up. And they're very flat, of course, because unlike the boat that's actually sailing, there isn't going to be that curve. There's no wind, or at least we hope there's no wind blowing. So even if you were to draw the Alabama as as a boat model, you would flatten that stuff out. The little flags have to actually be either I think they use cornstarch or something like that to make them actually rigid, or use a little piece of paper to make the flag so that it's rigid, because of course there's no wind blowing like there would be on a real one. But what it's really useful for is it's an opportunity to observe how a sailing boat goes together. So if you're not a sailor, this might be the first time you really had a look at it and said, okay, there's the mast and the boom. Most people know about that, and there's sails, but there are all these lines, and they have to go, they do something. So on a sailboat, you've usually got a line that goes from the top of the mast down to the front of the boat that it helps hold the mast up. And on more complicated boats, you'll even have more lines on the side that continue to do the same thing. You then have another line at the back from the end of the boom, the long piece of wood going horizontal, all the way up to the top of the mast, and that helps hold the end of the boom in place, so that when the sail is up, that's nice and rigid. And on some boats, you'll also have other lines that go from the mast down to the back of the boat. You'll have, as you see here, you've got lines that help hold the sails in place. You've got lines that come off the corners of the sails, so that when you're sailing, you can actually pull them into one side or the other. Otherwise, they'd just be flapping around. So this is kind of, for sailors, this seems like basic stuff, but if you've never sailed before or don't really understand the mechanics of a sailboat, some of these lines might be not only confusing, but also seem superfluous. And I'm sure I'm not the only sailor who's seen paintings in museums and galleries and other places where the lines that were added in were sort of random and didn't actually go along at all with how a boat ought to operate. So there's always a fine line between, adding in all the detail to make something look like it really should look, and going overboard. Because if you look over here at this lovely schooner sailing along, and you started trying to add all of that detail in, and anybody who's tried to paint something like that really knows in paint that's even more complicated. There's got to be a little bit of editing, to make something, unless you really are trying to make something like large, detailed, and super accurate. Usually there's some degree of editing that goes on with that, just to make it look possible. When you're so if you think you're ever going to have to draw a boat or something like that, it's useful, whether it's a boat model or just boats that you see around, to do a couple of sketches and try to figure out, well, what joins up to what and why. How low in the water does a boat sit? What does it look like if it's a sailboat, if the wind is blowing from one direction or the other? And this is stuff that just becomes part of your memory bank once you've drawn a couple, because they're complicated, and particularly if they're moving by quickly. I mean, that's very difficult even for somebody who knows what to do. But just as when I draw portraits, I now have drawn almost 100 portraits, and I now know that there are certain things I look for, like what on this person or that person, what does this bump on the nose look like? In some cases, if there's more flesh, I won't be able to see it. If a person has less flesh, it might be really bony. It might be located a little bit of a different area, but I always know to look for that. If once you've drawn boats a little bit, you'll be like, okay, first you'll be like, how many masts does it have? Where are the masts located? Because that kind of makes a difference how the boat is balanced. Then you might go, how many sails does it have? A boat such as this one that we see over here, this schooner, may not always have all the sails up. Some of them may be rolled up because it's a very windy day, or a different type of boat might be motoring and not have its sails up yet. All of that kind of stuff, that kind of observation comes over time. But even if you didn't already know all of that and you wanted to draw a ship's model, perhaps doing an interior, and go, hey, I would really like to put a ship's model over the fireplace in my drawing, you could do a general approximation based on just, even the way a kid draws a sailboat, a sail and a thing at the bottom, just to sort of put that object in place, knowing that you could fill in the gap later by either looking at real ones or looking at pictures. The idea is that you don't let the fact you don't already know stop you from doing anything you want in your drawing. All right, we're going to move on to the I think this is the last stage. So we're going to put our ship model in a window. And I just wanted to show you some windows first and talk about reflections, because reflections are one of the most difficult things to draw or paint. And when you manage to pull it off successfully, it's amazing, because they can be complicated, because they mess with our mind even while we're drawing them. It's very difficult to forget what we know about what's inside the building and what's outside, and look only at how this works. I had a situation recently where I was painting a woman with glasses, and there was a good reflection in the glass, and I had to concentrate on only the shapes I saw and forget the idea of either eyes or the background, and just sort of follow along. And you can see here that depending on how the light hits a window, sometimes you're going to get mostly the picture from outside. If you look at the middle photo, you can see the candle inside, but you can't see much more of the interior. Over on the left, you can see, there's an inside window or something of some sort. You can't really tell much else. And you can't really tell where some of these other shapes are coming from. Like, is there another interior window that you can see across the room, to make the light shape up in the upper left? And then you can see reflections of buildings and a sunset. Over here on the right is a picture I took in in Edgartown a few years ago. Super complicated, because there's a busy interior and a busy exterior. Very difficult. So when say you decide you are going to draw a ship model in a window that has some reflection, it's up to you to decide how much of the reflection you show and how much of the interior, because, the one will be a little obscured by the other. Your first attempt, you'll have no idea where to draw the line, so to speak. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all, because what will happen is you'll now start observing things in windows and reflections with a much greater understanding that if you were to draw this, you'd have to figure out where to make that call. So here are 3 examples. On the one on the left, the dark car and the dark shadow on the sidewalk make it very easy to see the ship, but the brightly lit upper part of the scene is reflected very heavily in the out window. in the middle one that's little with a little sort of Chinese junk there, you can't see much of a reflection. You can see mostly the interior, probably because it's dark behind. And then because of the angle this photo is taken and the one in the lower right, you can see the sky, but you really can't see anything of the interior beyond the ship itself. So how you decide to interpret this is going to be completely up to you. So what I'd like you to do is to put your model sailboat in this window. So this is a really kind of a basic style of window. What I would do first is a really super quick thumbnail sketch to figure out how big your boat's going to be. You can shrink your window if you want to, to have it only 6 panes or 4 panes if you just want to simplify things. If you're working on toned paper, don't worry about any of the woodwork or anything like that, or any of the bluey gray stuff of the sky, but you might want to put some dark of the reflection in, a little bit of white charcoal around the edges for the, for the kind of dilapidated window. And then you have to sort of figure out how much of the boat would I really be able to see? This is a pretty strong reflection. Maybe only certain parts of it can be seen, not the whole thing. If you're working on white paper, it's the same type of problem. Of course, you're not going to worry so much about the white around the edges of the window. But you'll have the same issue when it comes down to the bottom part of the reflection. How much would I be able to see? And there isn't a right answer. Each one of you are going to make a different call. Some of you are going to be like, "Huh, in mine, you can actually see the entire model. I'm not going to worry about obscuring it." And you might decide, "Hey, I'm going to draw the model in completely, but then I'm going to use my eraser to erase out little bits, or use the white charcoal pencil if you're working on toned paper to obscure some of what would be inside." You have to decide whether the reflection is lighter than, the same as, or darker than the sails of the boat inside. So this is where, the idea of something like a ship in a window does not sound like a particularly complicated concept. But once you actually start drawing it, you're going to find that you would want to go out and have a look and see sort of how does that kind of thing look? Maybe even set up an object in your own window, take a photo of it from outside and use that as the basis, even if the object you use was not actually the model boat. It would give you an idea of how much you could see. And so one of the things I do recommend is trying to draw reflections. And once you get the idea of kind of what a reflected object, not only what the reflection itself looks like, but what it looks like to have other things in the window or inside the interior that you can see just a little bit of, you'll be able to carry off some really interesting drawings, because our minds are willing to accept a great range of how much reflection or how much interior is there. It really is up to you to decide where you're putting the emphasis. Is the story of your drawing going to be about the reflection, which can be very cool, or is the story going to be about the object in the inside, or will it be a combination of both? People love to go to Menemsha, down to the fishing shacks down there, where there are objects hanging outside, but also objects hanging in the windows, fishing lures and buoys and things like that. And those are wonderful subject matter, because sometimes you see reflections of buildings or boats or whatever in the window, and sometimes you don't. Sometimes you see a reflection of yourself taking a picture. All of that is really great fodder for drawing, and it's a really great way to sort of hone the skills that you have. So we'll work for just a couple more minutes on this, or you'll work for a couple more. Don't you hate it when I say we and you're the one doing all the work, particularly when I've given you something really difficult like this? So I think that you can sort of see where I'm going with this. The more objects that you know how to draw, the more things you observe, the more you can put random objects together in whatever combination that you want to. You could put the sailing boat in the snow globe. It would still work. So just go ahead and wrap this up, and I'm going to move on. So before we finish up today, I just wanted to talk a little about Rene Magritte. And he was an artist who lived from 1898 to 1967. He was very prolific. He was a surrealist, and his work is often reproduced because it was just so very beautiful and entertaining. And you see him working on one of his paintings over here. And I just think that's wonderful. You know, he would often do these paintings that seemed very much like they were sort of self-portraits using the bowler hat. And there's a photograph of him on the right, you know, with the hat upside down on his head, because it became such a standard of his paintings. And he would do all kinds of things, silhouettes with these cutouts, odd objects that would suddenly appear. This beautiful scene on the side here, which I think is called Treasure Island, although the name is in French. What an amazing concept, and how very creative to put these objects together that you wouldn't otherwise have thought of. So a lot of surrealism involves that, you know, just sort of little kind of almost mind-bending drawings or illustrations. And I would really suggest, I won't show you more work today because we're sort of out of time, but look up the artwork of Rene Magritte, because he really, you know, you start to see that he just sort of took random ideas and put them together in very unusual ways. And yet they're all objects that we have seen before, which leads me to, you know, something that I think is really, really useful to do, whether you just do it as a mental exercise or actually physically sketch out, just thumbnail sketch some of these things. And that is practice sketching odd combinations of things. Don't worry about the details. But for example, you know, if you were to take these lists, which I have here, and which will be in the PDF I send around, and just sort of, you know, put them together in odd ways. So I've got fishbowl and a sky tram, you know, those little gondolas that go, I think that's the right name for the gondolas that go up a mountainside. What if in the fishbowl you had the little gondolas, you know, going up? What would that be about? What would the rest of the scene in the fishbowl be? What if you had a rolled up carpet in the vintage handbag? You know, what would that look like? What if the bugle actually had the shape of a pineapple? What if what if the row of medals on somebody's jacket were spoons, different types of, you know, old-fashioned spoons? So, you know, these are, I think it's fun to think about these sort of very odd combinations. Why would you use them? I don't know, because maybe you thought they were interesting, or you're going to use interesting symbols one day in a drawing that you're doing, and you want to bring in odd and unusual ideas. But one of the ways to sort of practice that, you know, you hear all the time that artists are not actually creating new things. They're just what looks very creative and new and fresh to us are just they're recombining ideas that are already out there. And just like Magritte did in terms of just putting things together and making something cool out of them, and then just like Norman Rockwell did by, you know, having an idea and then getting the reference for it later to actually make it happen. But the idea was his own very creative thing. I think this is where you go after you are already starting to get comfortable with drawing stuff. You're starting to feel like you've got a number of technical abilities under your, you know, whether it's graphite, charcoal, or whatever, under your belt. Then it's time to start letting your mind run amok and come up with some new ideas. So let's just go ahead and review. The concept, your own stories and interests are always a good starting point, as I've mentioned many times, for any drawing that has a theme or concept behind it. But you can draw anything that you want to, you know, mix and match, put odd items together. What would a top hat look like if it was a fishbowl? What would you need to know to pull that off? You might need to know how water in glass looks. You might need to know what a top hat looks like. You might need to think about how the reflections would work. How do fish look inside a fishbowl? All of that can be thought of later. Your little thumbnail just has to look like a top hat with some fish in, and then you go and you collect the rest of the reference and your own observation. And then as you go along, you'll be able to go, hey, I drew fish before. I know how that's done. I know exactly how to put them in that top hat fishbowl. So the technique, you now have the ability to mix and match drawing techniques using a variety of tools. Technique is now going to serve your broader purpose of producing interesting art. Work as we have this summer with all the pencil variety of hardness, different leads, charcoal, pencil, whatever you feel like, white charcoal. The eraser is a really powerful tool. You know, you don't want to forget about that at all. And of course, the paper color. So whether it's white or cream or toned or dark, the paper color is part of your drawing. That's really super important. And next week, what we're going to do is we're going to do a landscape scene that is very atmospheric, and will pull in all of what we've learned, but it's going to be very restful. It will not be stressful. There will be no gnomes, no boats. So let me go ahead and stop sharing the screen. Okay, everybody, thank you so much for making it through this class. I know that was some sort of odd stuff, but I hope it gives you a bit more confidence to go out there and try drawing anything. And I look forward to seeing you next week for our last class,
Nice.
which I can't believe,
Yeah.
19 classes. We've all made it. Thanks so much, everybody.